What has America's grand strategy been? And has it actually served the national interest? And so I'll just start at that 30,000 foot level view with you and get your take on that.
Yeah, well, I mean, no surprise. I don't think that it has. I think that it's been too much focused on, we call it national security strategy, but it's really focused on where can we use our military today
Yeah.
and how can we exploit something or some other place for our benefit, as opposed to what is supposed to be the case, which is what can we do? How can we use our national security capability, the armed forces, our economic power, our moral might? In ways that will keep us safe, that will keep our people free and prosperous, and give us a chance to do well economically on the global environment. That's what it's supposed to be. Now, if you have a strategy that'll do that, that says we are going to stay out of any war that we don't have to, we will only use our military when our national security is threatened. And if it is, we will use it to overwhelming power and we will crush any opponent, but we will only pull that sword out of its saber when it's absolutely necessary for our national security. Otherwise, we'll use diplomacy, we'll use our intellect, we'll use economic means, whatever, to keep our country safe. And that means sometimes a win-win situation for somebody else. It means sometimes maybe we don't get what we want. I mean, those are almost heretical ideas now, but you do those kinds of things as a matter of course, as a strategy, and you will keep your country safe indefinitely and prosperous and free. That's what a national security strategy should be, and how the military fits into that in an effective way, as opposed to the way we're doing it, which is we don't do win-win, we do win-lose.
Mhm.
And we do ways that we look to just do whatever we want, and we just don't accept no for an answer, even when it harms our interest to go down that path. And of course, I could talk forever on that.
And certainly something that I've been noticing, and I warned about when I was working in government, that actually things like going into Ukraine, the way that we've supported Ukraine, that actually is going to collapse the world order, the post Cold War order, far more than anything the Russians or Chinese could ever do to us. But our overreaction and overextension is actually bringing the end of that post Cold War era faster than I think anybody in DC realizes. And so it's sort of we're hoist by our own petard. And you bring up the national security strategy memo. Now, I knew about what was in that memo 7 months ago, 6 months ago. Bridge Colby is all over this thing, and he's been pushing the new national security strategy away from this sort of hegemonic globalist approach, at least in Eurasia, to something more akin to Western hemispheric defense plus Golden Dome missile defense. What is your take on this new national security strategy memo? Because all of my former colleagues in DC their hair is on fire, and I don't know. I mean, I don't like the idea of invading, Venezuela, but at the same time, the strategy seems to have everybody, all the right people, annoyed. So what do you think about this?
Well, I mean, let's just take a look at that piece of it. First of all, the whole Venezuela thing. That does not meet any of the criteria that I just mentioned
Yeah,
here. It is not necessary for our national security. It does not benefit our freedom, and it doesn't help us economically. It
yeah,
doesn't. And in fact, it could get us sucked into another Vietnam-esque
yeah.
or an Iraq-esque kind of morass. That's almost the best case scenario. The best case scenario might be that it just doesn't suck us in. And if that's the best you can have, then there should be no question that you don't go in there. Why am I going to sacrifice one American soldier
Mhm.
to something that doesn't need to be fought?
Yeah.
And we don't know how many could be sacrificed, or kill a bunch of Venezuelans on the ground that don't need to die. Look, whatever they got going on in their country, if the Maduro didn't actually win the election, whatever, that's something for
Mhm.
the people of Venezuela to address and solve or live with as they see fit.
Yeah.
I mean, that's up to them. It's not up to us to go fix that. And for some reason, that's what Trump said in a Politico
Yeah.
interview that came out, I guess, earlier this morning on the
Yeah.
9th. Um, that's not a reason you go to war. It's not in the Constitution. It's not in our War Powers Act. It's none of those things. So if that's your strategy, then we have a big problem. But
Mhm.
at least as I read the strategy, we want
Mhm.
to keep the hemisphere safe.
Yeah.
That fits within my parameters and what we should do. But if there's nothing going on in Venezuela that's threatening our national
Mhm.
security, then you can look on with interest. You can have some preferences on the outcome. You might even can engage diplomatically or economically if that potentially would help our position, et cetera. fair game, not the military. So, those people who are really excited about this and
Yeah.
think that we should be going down here, I mean, I would ask them, what is your motivation and where do you see this as fitting in with the American culture, the
Yeah.
American Constitution, and just how we operate as a nation? It's going to have some kind of positive benefit and
Yeah.
outcome. And I argue that the moral quotient is should be anyway inextricably connected with all of these physical attributes, because we like to call ourselves the city on a hill, the indispensable nation, and all this kind of stuff. Well, that comes with a cost,
Mm.
and it comes with a responsibility. You can't claim that mantle and then just throw it into the trash the minute it doesn't suit you, and go and be the brute that sometimes we point fingers against and rail against here. When we do that, Brandon, it completely sabotages and cuts our moral authority to point a finger at anyone else, because they'll mock us when they see
Yeah.
that we're doing the very thing that we're saying. So that is actually also hindering our national security when we don't follow what we claim to be our moral values.
So it sounds like what you're saying is, and feel free to correct me, in terms of the big picture, the national security strategy memo probably gets it right. But in terms of the application, it might be getting it wrong because we're kind of fixating now on Venezuela with military might.
If I haven't gone through all of
Okay.
it yet, I'll be honest, but I did read through the top line stuff, and everything that I read conceptually does sound good. I
Yeah.
mean, like I'm all for Europe taking more responsibility for
Yep.
itself. I'm all for, hey, let's don't do regime change. Ironically, at the Ronald Reagan conference a couple of days ago, Secretary Hegseth actually said that out loud, that
Yeah.
we're against regime change ops, and I'm
Yep.
going. Are you tracking? I mean, I'm just asking the question, but those are the kind of things that we need to be,
Yeah.
going into and asking. So the things that at least that I have read in the document conceptually sound good, but yeah, then the question is, does that really affect the president's thinking and his
Yeah.
actions? And I'm less confident that it does.
Yeah.
I don't know who actually authored this. I've heard a number of different people. One would imagine that the president signed off. I mean, he did literally sign the front
Yeah.
document of it, but I would wager he probably didn't read it.
No.
So I don't know how much it actually represents his thinking, and that's the
Yeah.
only one whose thinking actually matters. I mean, whoever wrote the document, and if Bridge Colby had some association with it, that could be really good. I like a lot
Yeah.
of the things that he
Me
says
too.
and does. He got a pretty good track record. But if it doesn't reflect the president's thinking, or if it doesn't represent a framework for his application of actions, then it's not a
Yeah.
particularly useful document.
Well, and I think we know that this is one of the big weaknesses of President Trump is, he kind of flies by the seat of his pants quite a bit. I mean, he will say one thing. I think President Xi, Trump was making a comment in the cabinet room in the last 24 hours, and he mentioned soybeans. American soybeans are the healthiest soybeans in the world. And apparently he said that to Xi, and Xi asked him, and he admitted this. Xi said, is that Trump saying that, or is that actual scientific fact? And so I think everybody's kind of figured out that Trump does kind of wing it a lot. And so even when he says something in a framework, it's not necessarily he's going to follow through, or if he does, it won't be exactly as they think it will. So I think that's
I
a
think
fair.
that's a charitable way to put it. Yeah.
I am being very charitable because I have a lot of Trump supporters in my audience, so I don't want to alienate everybody. But I am critical of him as well on certain things, and the application of force is one of them. And this gets us into sort of this larger question, because you mentioned, and I've been going back and forth with the neocons my entire career. So you mentioned sort of the moralism, right? You mentioned how, I thought it was interesting. You're talking about, moral authority here. It's the neocons who always claim they have the moral, authority, and everything is from this like moralistic standpoint. But I think you make the point that this is actually, what is America's moral authority in the world? Does it have any, or is it just another country, in the world?
Right now, I mean, I don't think you could defend anything other than it's simply a country in the world,
Yeah.
and it rules by the force of its power, economic and military power, because we can literally do what we want. And I'm talking about among our allies as well as a lot of our adversaries, or at least that's the way it has been. And one of the things I say a lot here lately is that it's not 1991 anymore,
Yep.
because we used to be able to tell everybody they could pound sand, whether
Hmm.
it's Europe, whether it's Russia, whether it's China. You know, after the Soviet Union failed, China was still basically a peasant army. They had not modernized yet. Their economy was growing, but it still was not on a technological level anywhere near where it is now. And
Yeah.
so we could literally dominate everything. But those days are over. We still have a tremendous amount of power, but so does China now. So does Russia. So does now
Hmm.
India rising, and now BRICS. It's providing
Yep.
a counterbalance to a lot of this stuff,
Yep.
requiring us to actually change. And I'm saying us in the West, you're going to have to change the way we do some business and recognize that we're not the only game in town anymore. And we have to actually provide a better service and a better
Hmm.
product and
Hmm.
give reason people around the other parts of the world a reason to want to do business here as opposed to over there. And so far, in the last 4 years or so, it seems that we're providing a lot of impetus and evidence for people not to go with the way we
Yeah.
are. There was an interview that I saw just this morning out of Russia. I think it was yesterday that it was made. Where no, it was a couple of days ago when some of the Indian telecasters were interviewing
Yep.
Putin, and they asked him, "Are you going to get back in the G7 if that's offered on the table?" And he said, "Why would I even want to anymore?"
Right.
He goes, "That's kind of like the old world. We're going into a new
Yep.
direction here." And because of all of our sanctions and everything that we've done to Russia since this war started out, especially Biden led this thing, we're going to crush Russia and we're going to do all this stuff. All we did is basically force them into a new direction
That's
and
right.
make them nearly impervious to any
That's
additional
right.
rounds of sanctions, which we still haven't gotten the memo on that. But Russia has. And so now then they're like, we have retooled, and some of these sanctions still hurt.
Hmm.
Putin even admits that. But they have made themselves structurally impervious to it. So now then they've got other places to go for modern, and that's not helping our side. And as
No.
long as we keep going down that path and
Hmm.
just trying to force a round peg into a square hole, it's just not going to work, because it's going to continue to force not just Russia and China, but others into their orbit. And
And
so,
it already is.
back to the
Yeah.
strategy, that's just not working out well for us.
No, it's not. And yet we have people in DC who fancy themselves as strategists. And yet what they're doing is exactly what you're describing, which is driving people away from the United States. You've worked in very high levels of the DoD for the US Army. Why do you think it's like this in DC? Why do you think we have these kinds of psyches running us right now, where it's like we're doing the opposite of what we should be doing? Is it intentional or is it just incompetence?
I think there are some, Brandon, that do it intentional. I think there are some that are aware, and they see financial gain, or they
Yeah.
see power gain in a narrow band for whatever their interests are. And they're fine if the ship ends up getting wrecked. They'll just hop off on another one, once it hits the rocks, as long as they can get all theirs when they go. And I think there's some that are like that. But I think the vast majority, though, haven't gotten the memo that it's not
Right.
1991 anymore.
Yeah.
And so I think that a lot of them, from a portion of sincerity, they grew up in the Cold War. They grew up understanding the world that existed there, and that we won the Cold War. And then
Mhm.
their minds shut down after that, and they quit looking around
The
anywhere else,
end of
because now then
history.
it's just myopic. Here, I'm just looking at what this is, because it'll just exist forever. And then anything that happens outside, well, is a threat, and it needs
Hmm.
to be opposed, as opposed to this is just the way the world is evolving and
Hmm.
growing. I mean, it goes through changes and evolutionary alternatives or adjustments, like it has through the last 2 or 3 thousand years, I
Yeah.
suppose. And instead of acknowledging that and being aware of it, and lifting your eyes up to the horizon off of the myopic ground in front of you, you're not going to be aware of this. And then when anything that you do see, you just view as a threat and
Yeah.
something to be countered, as opposed to something to be worked with. And I think
Yeah.
that's the reason that they can't change the way the mind was structured during the Cold War and the aftermath of it. And so now then our prisoner of our own success, if you want to call it that,
Yeah.
because we did have some success here. But now then we're so rigid, we can't change it with the flow of things, and it's just working out to our disadvantage.
What is it going to take to actually change, do you think? Because I have a very serious fear that we are on track to be involved in a major war and we are actually going to lose. And I'm worried that's what it's going to take. And by then it's too late. What do you think is it going to take to actually force change at the highest levels of power so we don't keep falling into these bad patterns?
And at this point, I mean, I preach probably some of the same things that you do
Yeah, you
about
do.
what we should do,
Yeah.
about how we can, from this moment, before any kind of bad things have happened, we can shift gears, we can change the rudder, we can go away from the rocks, etc. But we won't. I think that there's no chance of it. I don't even think there's a little chance. I think there's none.
Mhm.
I think that we're too rigid of the mind that we can't change, and too many people who are in the positions of power benefit from it, and they would have to change and willingly cede some of their power or financial benefits, whatever, to do something else that makes sense, and they're not going to. And I mean, historically, people just
Yeah.
don't do that. And so I think that it will be one of two other ways. One is it will be we'll get sucked into a war we should never have fought and can't win, as you said, and I could go into many military reasons why we wouldn't, especially if the opponent was China over a South China Sea or Taiwan
Mhm.
issue, or Russia anywhere involving the Ukraine situation if it expands beyond that. Uh, or an economic collapse that the before we get sucked into a war, our this massive weight of debt
Mhm.
and unsustainability of so many bubbles that we've got going on here, we just ignore them, and there's an economic collapse, which then causes a societal fracture,
Mhm.
and then we could have some akin to a civil war or a civil destruction here at home that could then force us to retool and everything. But I fear one way or the other it's either a financial collapse and a lot of dangerous and scary things come along with that at home, or a military collapse, or of course, if that happens, it may well be both. I don't see a
Yeah.
way around it.
Yeah, I do think we are headed toward both. And I think AI is only exacerbating a lot of these issues. And I think you're probably right. I'm seeing a parallel track. I think Ray Dalio has been talking a lot about this as well, and I think he has
Yeah.
a book about it. And I think you guys are probably onto it. Not to be a total black pillar here, but what? So we talk a lot about the kind of the new. I think it's a tripolar world trending toward multipolarity. And I think America is a declining power in that scenario. Um, if we did get into a conflict with, say, Russia, what are some things that the Russians are doing that are effective that we're not doing? A couple, two or three
Well,
things you can
I,
think of.
I think that the primary thing is that the flexibility of the mind
Yeah.
militarily. If we have rigidity of the mind, they have flexibility of the mind. And
Mhm.
in my view, one of the best near-term examples of that is in drone warfare.
Mhm.
Now, when the war started with between Russia and Ukraine, I actually thought that Russia would be much further advanced than they were
Yeah.
with drones. And the reason for that is because if anybody paid any attention at all to the Armenia Azerbaijan war
Mhm.
of 2020,
Yep.
there was a dramatic change in how maneuver warfare was done because of the use of drones. And given Russia's association with Armenia and Azerbaijan and their fact that it's right there in their backyard, I figured they'd be all over this. And so I thought when the war started with Ukraine, I figured that from the beginning, they would be leading the front edge with the drones. And in
Yeah.
fact, they weren't. Turns
Yeah.
out that they had hardly done anything. They were still fighting as they had, been training for the decade or so prior to that.
Mhm.
And it was the Ukraine side that had used the Bakhtiar 2 drone, I
Yep.
think, from the Turks that
The
had been
Turks.
so
Yeah.
successful in the Armenia Azerbaijan war. So they kind of had the lead up on that at the first. And it took Russia a long time to figure this out. And they had some disastrous tactical operations. One particular one over a river, I remember, I want to say March or I'm sorry, no, more like June or July of the first year of the war,
Mhm.
because they didn't understand the con. They were trying to do a river crossing, and they had this like a whole battalion task force was basically wiped out because they didn't know what they were doing. They didn't
Mhm.
understand the war, and they hadn't changed anything from it. But then they
They
through
adapted.
blood and much loss, they said, snap, this ain't going to work. So let's figure out
Mhm.
what is. And they changed how they do business. They changed who they put in positions. They got guys out that weren't performing. They put guys in who were, et cetera. And then now then that translated into how they conduct their operational art as well. And that even includes how they do their industrial capacity. And so then now they see, okay, and by the way, this is largely mirrored on the Ukraine side. So really, both sides are doing this to one degree or another. But they see what works. Okay, this works. This doesn't work. All right, now this isn't working, and it was. Now, oh shoot! Now they're doing something else. I got to figure out what. So this nimbleness of mind is created out of necessity, and so Russia has learned to do that.
Yeah,
we haven't. And there was an article in Monday's. I guess it was what is today? So it was I guess the 8th of December. There was an article in the Military Times. It said the United States was going to embarking on this new drone program to where Hegseth said we're going to have 300,000 drones in our inventory by 2027. And I'm thinking that got me alarmed because I'm like, hang on, Russia is going to have produced around 2 million of them this year. Ukraine is producing somewhere around 100,000 a month. Of even with all of their disparities and the difficulties that they have, they're still producing that many. And depending on which part of the front they're on, these things have anywhere from a 10 to 25% effective rate because of electronic warfare, because of drone-on-drone things, because of other countermeasures, et cetera. So you've got to have mass so that when this small number gets through, whether it's 10 or 25%, you can still have effects on target, et cetera. We're talking that in 2027, we could have up to 300,000. Listen, based on what has happened here with the current war here, I mean, you've probably gone through 5 or 6 iterations of what works, doesn't work, counter work, et cetera, go back and forth just within the matter of 5 or 6 months. And what works right now, what you're putting money towards, what you're manufacturing, a year and a half from now, I mean, come on, Brandon, that's not going to work. And number one, you're going to have not 300,000, but maybe 300,000 a month.
That's right.
You fight a war with Russia. That's where I was going with all this.
Yeah.
You talk about what would happen if we, by whatever means, ended up in a conventional clash with Russia. We don't have the defense industrial base.
Nope.
We don't have enough troops. We don't have enough airframes. We definitely don't have enough air defense. That's probably one of our biggest shortfalls. And we keep giving it to Ukraine side, and we don't have enough in our own inventories, and our production level is a little higher than it was, but marginally so, whereas Russia recognizes it, and they have been stockpiling this stuff. So everything that matters, we're still thinking it's Desert Storm, man. We're still thinking it's Operation Iraqi Freedom and all this. I'm sorry, maybe I'm talking too much.
No, you're this is a guest-driven show. Please go.
There was 2 or 3 months ago now, sometime this summer, there was the U.S. Army released an updated tactical manuals for the armor platoon. And I used to be an armor officer, so I'm interested in that stuff anyway. And I was curious how they were going to do it. And so they basically took the same tactics that we used when I fought in Desert Storm, or when I was the executive officer for an armored cav squadron under the 1st Armored Division, one of my last tactical assignments in the 2000s. And so I wanted to see where we're going in it now. And it was slight modifications of the 2000 version when I was in an armored cav squadron. And the Ukraine army mocked it, not the Russians, but the Ukraine side said, "You've got to be kidding me. You think this is going to work?" I mean, we allegedly have all these advisors and all kinds of people embedded all over the place, from general down to sergeants and lieutenants and captains, et cetera. And I'm thinking, are any of you talking to the guys writing doctrine back in Washington, D.C.? Because that ain't going to fly, man. What I saw produced there, I agree with the Ukraine side that this is not going to work at all. And look, all I'm doing is I got my show here, and I talk to people who are fighting on both sides of this line to get an idea how the war is being conducted. And from a distance, I've never been to the front in this war. Nobody will let me go. That's a separate issue. But even from the distance, I can think, I can see this way of war that we're doing has to radically change from what we're doing. And yet I see incremental changes. And when I just see even this with the drones, that you're talking, you're going to do something that in a year and a half from now, you're going to have 300,000. When you see the protagonists here are somewhere around 100,000 per month. I don't understand that, man.
Well, I was told the Russians were collapsing and they can't produce anything. And then I turn around and I actually look at the data, and it's like everybody in DC, I think, is drinking their own Kool-Aid. I think they really believe.
And I don't know, man. Maybe
a buddy of mine at DIA told
Kool-Aid.
A buddy of mine at the DIA said to me about a year and a half ago that nobody in DC seems to understand that, for instance, the casualty numbers, that we're getting exclusively our data from the Ukrainian intelligence services, who have a desire to lie to us about how many people they're losing versus how many people the Russians are losing, because they want us to keep in the war. And if we think that the Ukrainians are being slaughtered, which they are, we're not going to want to keep going, because that's the fear in Kyiv. So they lie, and our intelligence services repackage those numbers, that data, and we give it to the president and to the Congress as if that's sacrosanct. And I think that happens not just with casualty rating. I think it's happening with everything in the war, where we're just relying on people on the ground who have an interest in lying to us. And this is one of the reasons why you're seeing this distortion in our policy.
Brandon, I heard earlier, the latter part of this summer, from two separate sources, ironically on the same day, but totally disconnected, that told me the same thing that you're telling me. Because someone had contacted me because they said, listen, now I watched one of your shows, and you're saying something that's not accurate, by the way, and I want to correct you. So, but they wouldn't tell me over the phone or text, whatever, because they didn't want to take any chances anybody would hear. So we had to literally meet someplace private. And I was wondering, what is he talking about? What am I saying that's not accurate? Because I think I vet what I say pretty carefully. Well, it turns out that the thing that he pointed out was that what I said was, I hear these casualty numbers said by our highest level of officials, and I said they've got to know that that's nonsense. So that means that they're using disinformation to try to keep everybody involved with it. And he says, no, man. He goes, that's not the case. They actually think that's the right information because the intelligence agencies are repackaging the stuff from Ukraine, knowing that it's not right, because they do have the knowledge. And then they're telling our leaders that that's the case because they want them to stay in the fight. That's concerning, actually, on a separate level.
Well, it is.
But it reinforces what you said.
I mean, I don't want to get strong language here, but to me, that's borderline coup-like behavior. I mean, if you're lying and your job is to give accurate information to elected leaders from both parties who have to make decisions based on that, and you're purposely manipulating them, that's unconstitutional in my view. But we see this playing out. I mean, I remember in 2019 meeting with Dan Crenshaw, and him gloating about how he and Ted Cruz and Lindsey Graham and Marco Rubio meeting Trump in the Yellow Oval Office in the East Room basically manipulated Trump into not following through on his promise to pull U.S. forces out of Syria. And I asked him, well, how did you do that exactly? He goes, we stroked his ego all night. And that to me is not acceptable. And then you hear from, back in the first term about Syria, where you had our people on the ground were actually just not implementing Trump's orders at one point to pull forces out of Deir ez-Zor. And so I can imagine this is happening on an even grander scale.
Well, Brandon, that's conceptually the identical thing that led me to giving my my whistleblower stuff back in 2012 when I came back from my second Afghanistan tour, because instead of manipulating intelligence, it's that the senior military leaders were lying about what was happening on the ground and claiming that the war was winning and all this kind of stuff. So you see, it's a perpetuation of the same thing we've seen. And I'm sure those generals thought they were doing the right thing in their mind and their interpretation.
I'm sure. Yeah,
no, they were lying, and just don't use any other word. It's not an exaggeration. It's a lie, because you're not winning. But see, their thought was, but if I tell them the truth, those civilians won't understand, and they would end the war. They would pull us out before we could win. But if we have enough time, then you see where this is going. Yeah. You set yourself up as that better than anybody the actual constitutional system.
That's right.
And so now we see it manifesting here, and I can only imagine this happens all over the place.
All over, and there's so much money washing through Ukraine. There's so many hands in the till. I mean, Cofer Black from CIA was on Burisma's board. Obviously Hunter Biden was involved. I mean, this thing is so nasty what we are involved in, and it's one big money laundering operation. That's my opinion, but I think that's all this is. And so, I'll navigate away from that and go back to your expertise in the military. And I'm going to ask you because you are a tank guy, and I grew up, I love the tank too. I think it's cool. I was reading an article, I think it was in the Military Times actually, and I know I reported on it in the National Interest, but an article was talking about how we were testing the Abrams tanks in the Polish mud. We were getting them ready for operating in muddy Eastern European conditions, and this is in the last couple weeks. Is the tank even viable anymore, or is it obsolete? Because I often say the aircraft carrier is obsolete. A lot of my Navy friends hate that, but I'm starting to think the same thing I think about the carrier. I'm starting to think about the tank, judging from how things have played out in Ukraine. Am I wrong, or is this more correct?
I'll start it with the aircraft carrier. I'm 100% in agreement
Yeah.
that the aircraft carrier is no longer the central power projection vehicle that it has been, and
Mm.
was decisive in World War II. Just like that rendered the battleship
Yep.
no longer the central figure before that, but there was still room for, at least at that time, a battleship per
As a
se. And now,
support.
of course, it's turned
Yeah.
into missile carriers, et cetera. So I
Mm.
think that aircraft carriers can have a role, but they are so much more vulnerable than anyone
Yeah.
recognizes. And they're now relegated to a fringe, or we're going to see them drop to the bottom of
Yep.
some angry sea someplace. And I fear, I guess, kind of back to your original comment, that's probably an inevitability because I don't see us figuring this out in time.
No.
But to my little favorite thing here with the tank, uh, my view is that the tank has been knocked off of its pedestal of being the king of battle. When we fought in Desert Storm, we were told in the Second U.S. Cavalry Squadron, we were leading that big Seventh Corps punch into the Republican Guard that where they were dug in the Kuwait, et cetera.
Nice.
And H.R. McMaster, who was my troop commander, who was
Mm.
subsequent to the National Security Advisor, and
Hmm.
Doug McGregor, who was the operations officer for the
Hmm.
squadron at the time, they both told all of us, like a religious fervor, that the safest place you can be on the battlefield is in an M1 tank heading directly
Nice.
toward the gun tube of any enemy vehicle because they could not penetrate the frontal armor,
Yep.
anything that they had. And we lived it and we believed it and it was
Hmm.
true. And so we were just absolutely fearless in going forward. Now, I wasn't in one, so I was kind of tucked in behind them
Uh-huh.
because my frontal armor could be penetrated. I was in a fire support vehicle. I'll just throw
Okay.
that out there. But see, that's actually an analogy here too, because my vehicle was not impervious to everything that's going on there. So I had to fight in a different way and be tucked
Yeah.
in behind one of these other vehicles here. Same with the tank now, because not just are some of these anti-tank weapons, I mean, even a direct fire anti-tank weapon can penetrate the frontal armor of nearly any tank on the battlefield today, to include the M1. But much more, of course, big is the drone threat. It has rendered the tank very, very vulnerable, as we saw in the Ukraine, who did not learn this lesson and would not
Yep.
accept the theory and tried to prove it true with NATO training, by the way, in
Yep.
2023. And we saw the Bradley graveyard, as some called it, and you saw this just wreckage of vehicles burning everywhere. And so we realized that you can't do Operation Iraqi Freedom anymore. You can't do a
Nope.
Desert Storm kind of deal. Those days are over. Period. Full stop. But that means that the tanks are altered in their importance. You can't not have them. You can't just say, all right, well, now it's just drones, because a drone can't take land. A drone can't defend land. Only a
Mhm.
man can. You still have to take territory and you have to defend territory one way or the
Mm.
other. The drones are profoundly important, but even though they can go and blow something up, until you can physically remove the guys from this position, you don't have it. And so you can't, nor can you defend the territory. So the tanks are, and I talked to some Russians here recently, and even and read some Ukraine reports
Hmm.
likewise. They're using them kind of fire support vehicles.
Yep.
So they will get them into an area where they have some kind of control. They have, a canopy of control, whether that's electronic or physical, et cetera.
Hmm.
And then they can, if you're going to have some troops that want to go in to take a ridge line, for example, you can use the tank as distant fire support as long as you have a line of sight. And that's a lot of firepower on top of the artillery, on top of the mortars, on top of the drones and other kinds of rocket artillery, et cetera. So it's a mix of all those things, but there's a place for it. Likewise with the armored personnel carrier, you still got to have it to get from relatively safe from one place to another. With the drones, you've seen this proliferation of dune buggies,
Yep.
of motorcycles, and small 2- and 3-man groups because they spread out and it's a lot harder to get with that.
Yeah.
The motorcycles can jockey around and actually
Sort of like
provide,
Mad Max.
yeah, it is. Yeah, there was this Mad Max video that was
Yeah.
trending here a month or so ago, because that's what was working. But the armored vehicles still exist. And I'll tell you one other thing.
Yeah.
This is so important. The idea that now then armor is just relegated to the sidelines or just to ferry people up. That's only in the case where you're fighting where you have a front line like this. But in Russia's opening salvo, when there weren't all of the, other than the Donbass area, when they didn't have all of these trench lines and defense fortifications, et cetera, it was just territory was open. You could have, and they did, have large scale armor movement, and they blitzed in and went a long way because you didn't have the drone situation wasn't set up. See, like in all these current line of contact, you have drones set up a web of them all the way across on both sides of the line where the drone operators go, et cetera, where the points for logistics go, et cetera. So you have to now intricately fight, you just piece by piece through all this territory. But in the event, let's say that there is a conflict between Russia and NATO, and if Russia were to, whatever reason, if some war started by whatever reason, and Russia wanted to rush forward, we don't have a line of contact on our eastern flank right now, and you could burst through with a like a shock and awe kind of situation. To a country that's not suspected. So you can have a big initial thrust with lots of armor, tanks leading the way, because it would provide this shock effect, et cetera, especially if you have your doctrine adjusted and you have mobile drone operators going along with that first level. So there is still a place for that. And if you don't have a series of trench lines and fortifications and multiple fallback defensive lines, which in my view, NATO is absolutely just incompetent that they haven't already provided that. They claim that they're worried about Russia coming in, yet they haven't done any defensive lines.
Well, they're expecting us to do it.
I don't know what they're expecting, whether us to do it or somebody else. You see what Russia did in 2023 with their defensive belts, the 5 defensive lines that only one of which ever got up to and not that fully penetrated. And you see what the Ukraine side has been doing since that time forward with all these intricate belts of defensive lines and how hard it is for Russia to get through it, et cetera. That should tell you that is the form of warfare that's going to slow things down and give you a chance to fight. That should be already being under construction on the entire eastern flank of NATO if you're really concerned about a Russian advance someday. Because if you don't do that, you are literally opening yourself up for a genuine war of maneuver kind of shock and awe kind of operation. So those things still exist, and Russia is still building up its forces for that. So something needs to be paid attention to.
And I know you got a heart out, so this will be my last question. Do you believe NATO is capable of adapting to this new form of warfare, or is it, as I've suspected, just a Potemkin force?
It is a Potemkin force today, but it is capable of doing it because there are some brilliant people. And every NATO country I've ever met, there's some brilliant people in there.
Agreed.
But it's the guys at the top that are ossified in their thinking and have this rigidity of mind that won't allow them to do. I mean, just look at Macron, Merz, Starmer, Mark Rutte, Ursula von der Leyen, et cetera. All these guys are at the top are just blinded by anything except for a hatred of Russia, and they're blinded by modernity. They don't want to do anything different.
Yep.
And so even if there are, and by the way, you can add some generals into that same category, unfortunately, because you've had to be a political animal to get up there.
Yep.
But there are plenty of people at the front, and especially at the medium level, that are well aware of what's happening here, and they're just in anguish about recognizing what's not being done. So we could do it, but I guess circling back to what you said at the beginning of this episode here, I don't think we will. I think that we're going to, that ossified leadership, I think is going to take us all down with it.